next guest is the executive producer and host of the award-winning radio series, A Moment in Time. The mission is to excite and enlighten the public about the past, its relevance to the present, and its impact on the future. Today, we're talking about the history of plagues. We welcome Dr. Dan Roberts back to Virginia this morning. Dan, it's wonderful to see you. This is a particularly heavy topic, but pretty relevant right now.
It certainly is. The death toll worldwide is mounting daily, and it's just really a terrible time.
We've said before, history is unfolding before our eyes right now. But what's interesting, you sent a bunch of notes on these plagues of the past in our history books. And when I was reading through that, I thought, wow, history repeats itself, doesn't it?
It certainly does. We've been through this before, in surprisingly horrific ways. Just in the 1,000 years since the 1300s. So,
in perspective, there probably have been at least three or four major worldwide pandemics. Can you start us from the beginning?
Sure. Well, probably the first that has gripped the mind and mentality of those of us in the Western Hemisphere, but also for worldwide, was known as the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. Over 200 million people died in the Black Death because essentially we had no either herd immunity, we had no immunity at all, and you could see the wave of deaths sweep across Europe. These are well documented. It was probably terrible. It was either the bubonic plague, which was spread by the bite from fleas borne by rats from Western Asia, but also the pneumonic version of that, in which the plague was spread by in similar ways to COVID-19, spread through droplets that came out of people's mouths and noses and their respiratory system, and then would infect other people. But I mean, it was horrific. It was a really interesting thing about the Black Death is that as people died, they would take their bodies and throw them into the street, and then people would come along, appropriately hooded, and carry them out and put them into mass graves. There's something akin to that in COVID-19 that we have today, in which we see in places that are heavily hit like New York, in which they take people, and instead of taking them to the graveyard, or instead of their families having an opportunity to mourn and to bury them, they're stacked up in trailers backed up to the hospital. And families are not able to mourn the loss of their loved ones. It's very similar to the Black Death.
And that paints quite the picture, Dan, when you think about it in that perspective. Black Death, and then, of course, Spanish flu was another pandemic that posed similarities to COVID-19. That's
right. And it really ought to be called the American flu, because the best studies have indicated that it started among American servicemen at Camp Funston in Kansas. But the government was panicked about it and wouldn't tell people what was happening. And so they sent those soldiers that were infected and put them on troop ships, which then turned into death ships, and they sent them to Europe, and that American soldiers essentially spread the so-called Spanish, but American flu, all around the world. And we don't know the exact number that has indicated it, but they are much larger at this point. That a long time ago, we thought it was about 100,000 Americans died during that period of time, but it probably was closer to millions of Americans died as a result of that.
Wow, pretty profound. And we did say this was a heavy topic, but I do think it is important to talk about that historical perspective. More recent history, of course, was AIDS and HIV.
That's correct. And nobody knew what it was at first. It was called the gay disease, or the gay cancer, when it came out in 1981. And the government, President Reagan, never mentioned the term HIV or AIDS until 1985. And by that time, hundreds of thousands of people had been affected, and many of them were dying. It was one of the worst, and right now, it continues to infect the world. It continues because there has never been a vaccine against it. There are prophylactic drugs which prevent people from catching it, and there are ways of containing the virus within the body. We are able to do that medically, but we have never been able to find a cure for it, or say a vaccine for it. And so therefore, in some areas of the world, it continues to grow, and we have about 200,000 victims at this point, and that number is mounting on a regular basis. It's really a sad thing because it took out an extraordinarily number of people. At first, it was thought to be a gay thing, and then heterosexuals began to catch it, and then intravenous drug users began to catch it. It was it was and continues to be a plague of pandemic proportions in the world.
And Dan, of course, we're living right now in the pandemic of COVID-19.
Right.
What comfort, we have about 30 seconds left, is there comfort for you in looking at history, at the perspective that it provides, and sort of framing today's present situation?
Yes. Our governmental institutions, particularly at the state level, are responding in amazing ways, and people are responding in ways that indicate that they realize the profound danger that they face, and they are staying home. That is very, very encouraging. And the places in which this pandemic is coming under control have been the places in which people have taken seriously the notion of physical separation and just staying at home with their families, and either working from there or taking time away from the possibility of infecting others. That's encouraging.
It is encouraging, and thank you for sharing about 5 moments in time with us today. It's always wonderful to see you. Appreciate having this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, and appreciate everyone for joining us this morning and for doing their part to stay home. That's not particularly easy either, as things are swirling around. For more information, you can visit amomentintime.com. You can always follow Dan Roberts on social media, on Facebook at A Moment in Time with Dan Roberts, Instagram at DRobertsAMIT 2019, and on LinkedIn at Dan Roberts. All right, you know how to connect with Dan and enjoy a moment in time. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Virginia This Morning.